And yeah, I've seen some colleagues from Ipsos as well, I think. Hi, guys.
Yes, exactly. So let's start. Welcome to everyone who could join us today. Special thanks to you, Dave, for wanting to join our dialogue, and Gabi for making it possible. I will ask in a second Gabi to introduce Dave and also to to tell us a little bit of the history of how you've been working with Dave in the past within Waters, Romania. And just some practical details. We are going to have a small introduction, which is just started, and also Gabi, you have a welcome note, and then Dave, you are going to introduce us in the subject, and at the end we'll have a section dedicated to a dialogue. We hope it's a dialogue. We'll start with the Q&A, but anyone who has comments, examples from their work that you think it's relevant to this, please, you are more than welcome to have them, in the discussion. There are more people that are joining. Meanwhile, Gabi, you have the floor.
All right, thanks, Mihai. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see a lot of colleagues, former colleagues, new acquaintances. And this all had been made possible by Dave and him being very flexible on this. We've been working together for a bit more than a year, and Dave and his work have been introduced to me by Andy. And thanks, Andy. I know he's with us on the webcast. So we started together a journey a bit more than a year ago on how our organizational culture could evolve. Waters being active in the specialty measurement field worldwide, and in that space, we play a very narrow niche as well in liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, having in Romania the largest R&D center for Waters Corporation, headquartered in Boston, in Milford, Boston, Massachusetts. We produce a lot of the software that goes with our instruments. And our instruments are used, and it's quite interesting in today's world, are used mainly by pharma industry. 60% of our client base is there in that space, and they are using the instrumentation for the quality control, meaning drug discovery, drug validation, biomedical research are the areas that use heavily our software and hardware. So wanting to evolve our culture from where it is, and it's an agile organization, the one in Romania, I always felt like, I need something for this. Just the classic way of going through the change and change management, I don't think it's suited. So intuitively, I had a lot of instincts in this space, even in my previous jobs. But with Andy introducing Dave works to me, I got more and more to realize that actually Dave had given me a framework, an intellectual framework of a lot of my intuitions. So we engaged slowly from an agile scan to see where our culture is from the agile perspective, and then started to explore where it could evolve. So it's a bit more than a year journey, and we've seen significant progress. We did several things along the road, and we still have a lot in the pipeline. His tools, Dave being the creator of Canavin framework and the pioneer in complexity science. The tools he had created and evolved along the years have helped us navigate this evolution of our organization, and are very suited, I would say, in today's world. And I will draw now the parallel. We have a 200+ organization, which is a community. And if we look at it as a community, we want to feel part of a community. In today's crisis, I think communities are crucial, and active involvement of everyone within their own community at micro scale, because I think it's difficult, and Dave will give us more background of that. It's difficult to act at global scale, Yeah, most people won't be able to relate on big, huge programs that or large organizations are trying to activate in various situations. But when you act at micro level within your community, yeah, by driving actions that everyone could understand, like Dave had used several times examples like let's go clean the beach if we are on a seashore, yeah, or if we are at a festival in a small town, let's make sure it's cleaned up. My Romanian colleagues here that have been participating in the protests a year ago will know that in Piazza Victoria in Bucharest, the protesters cleaned after themselves, yeah. Those small actions within communities are meaningful actions that everyone can understand and can relate to. And from those small actions, you build a bigger picture, in my opinion, rather than the other way around of having these massive, huge programs like let's reduce climate. I mean, let's have an impact on climate change, and we launch a worldwide program to reduce climate change. Yeah, very few people would be able to relate to that, and I've been hearing Dave talking about it on several other webinars in the past. He will be probably telling us some things about it. Yeah, but yeah, it's clear that there is a parallel. Yeah, the world today is composed of multiple communities, and there is no one size fits all. Each community has to find, I think, its own way of acting. Yeah, and then the synergies that you create from those communities will happen. Yeah, and that's, I think, the way to go. Yeah, we all need to be part of redefining the new normal. I think it's by now pretty clear for everybody there won't be ever a return to the former normal. And if we want this new normal to be grounded on a solid foundation, yeah, we have to work on that foundation and then build on top of it. Yeah? So with no further ado, yeah, thanks Dave again for your flexibility, and Mihai for partnering with us on this journey. I'll give the floor to Dave.
Yeah. Okay. So just to warn you, I sometimes speak too quickly. Yes, I'm Welsh, I'm not English, and we tend to merge words together. If I start to do that, please say something in the chat area. So I've got the chat open, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through the course of this session. Yeah. So my idea is to give a fairly high-level picture, and I really want to focus on some of the current practice around COVID. So some of the work we're doing, for example, with families and communities, and that's part of what Gabriel has talked about, which is the concept of a new normal. The trouble is the history of the human race evolving from a crisis is generally bad. So the sort of growth of populism, you can actually see this with the attempts in the US and the UK to put all the blame on the World Health Organization and the like. Those are the sort of things we've also got to counter. So I'm going to go a bit between the big issue and the small issues as we go. So just to give you the background on this, it started about 20 odd years ago. I was strategy director of a company which got taken over by IBM. And I got given one of those roles, which is kind of like, do whatever you want as long as it's interesting and we'll pay you some money. Those were the days when IBM did that, and it was fun to do work there. And I really, at that time, my focus was on how do we improve decision making. That's my background, my thesis is decision support systems. I've also got a strong background in community activism. So immediately after university, I worked in the program to combat racism in the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and worked with Aboriginal land rights in Northern Australia, on the banks of the Zimbabwe, on the PCR around Zimbabwe at that time, and also in the slums of Buenos Aires. So kind of like, that was all when I was very young and in my 20s, but it kind of like informed a lot of what came after. And it stopped me believing that solutions could be achieved top down. And I'm going to make 2 or 3 key points to this, which may or may not upset people. And if I do, I don't apologize. Right? One is that goal-based attempts, and I didn't know the science at the time, but deciding how things should be and then trying to achieve them is generally a mistake. If you actually do small things in the present, you can actually achieve far more significant change downstream. Now, I now know from what we know about complexity science, because what I started to do in IBM was to take a natural science approach. And one of the things we know about a complex adaptive system is that you can't define a linear relationship between cause and effect. So you can never say, if I do this, it will produce that outcome. Because the next time around, it may produce a slightly different outcome, and everything will vary. So in a very real sense, in complexity, we start journeys rather than trying to achieve goals. And if you start a journey, there are a couple of important things to work on. One is you have to map where you are. And you have to map what we call the adjacencies, because you want to see what movements are possible and which movements aren't. And the great thing about starting journeys is you can be open to novel discovery. You've got a sense of direction, but not a specific goal. Now, we've seen a lot of the problems that have come out of goal-based behavior, and this really started in the 80s. So, for example, we know from a whole body of research, and I can give you the academic references on this, that where people are working for extrinsic goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. So if you give people a whole set of explicit targets, they will focus on achieving the targets. They won't actually focus on achieving what the targets are meant to measure. It doesn't work that way. And we've done, for example, a big project in the north of England, which identified that the main cause of mental breakdown in emergency services was actually the health and safety regulations, not the job. Because the degree of measurement and control with the health and safety regulations meant that people couldn't do the job that they joined up to do. And I'll give you two illustrations. From field ethnography, every nurse in a British hospital breaks the safety rules at least twice a day in order to provide empathetic care to patients. If they followed the safety rules, the patients would have a really bad time. Yeah? One of the stories we got in the north of England thing was a fire officer who arrived at a frozen pond in winter. A kid had run after his dog. His dog had gone through the ice. Kid had run after, run out as well to get the dog. Kid had gone through the ice. Fire service were called. They got there. The kid was still alive. But they had to do a safety assessment before they were allowed to go on the ice. And the safety assessment said it wasn't safe, so they had to call out another truck. In the time while that happened, the kid died. But as the fire officer said to me, but the dog lived. And I've never forgotten him saying that, because this guy had now been off for work for 9 months and no prospect of going back soon. He'd actually done the job. He'd followed the measurement system, but he hadn't done what he thought was the human aspect of it. So the dehumanization, particularly in the development and not-for-profit sector, of the desire for explicit targets, the desire to always tell in advance exactly what you'll achieve, really destroys innovation. And it means that people spend 20 or 30% of their grant money actually on how do we keep the donors happy rather than how do we do the thing that people have donated for. So that's one of the areas we wanted to do something about, and it's an area we work, and I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the key principles about complexity theory is that you start journeys, you don't try and achieve goals. It's critical to understand where you are and actually where you can go next. Yeah, and one of my hobbies is walking in the mountains, yeah, and I've now decided I'm coming back to Romania for that, having had a taste of it with Gabriel on my last trip before the close down was actually to Romania. So having had a taste, in the mountains, one of the things you're very careful about is you don't say, oh, I want to achieve that goal and run off in a straight line, because you may fall off a cliff. It's actually quite important to understand where you are, the risk, the plausible steps. You may end up going a long way round because that's safer rather than the direct route. But you can actually adjust your pathway as you go. The second thing about complexity is that small things produce a massive effect. It's the little things that matter, not the big things. So small things can amplify very, very quickly. So again, to give an example, one of the community engagements we did recently was to use children as ethnographers in the valleys of South Wales. Now again, this is a technique I'm going to talk about. one of the things we don't want is for the experts to go into a community and be the expert. And I've also gone heavily off facilitation. People go in and run workshops or run labs. And this has become subject to heavy criticism from the anthropology, because the people who turn up, or the people who are privileged at those workshops, the people who match the culture of the facilitator. It's a new form of neocolonialism. So what we wanted to do was to empower communities to actually understand their own situation and come up with their own nudges to reference behavioral science. So rather than to be yanked by some expert sitting in government, to actually identify that change was possible and do small things that would then magnify that change. So what we did is we used sports clubs. In South Wales, it was actually girls' rugby clubs, which are the main ones. You need to understand that South Wales, which is where I come from, is a matriarchal culture. So the order of fear is you're mildly scared of your wife, you're terrified of your daughter. You do exactly what your mother says. If your grandmother is angry with you, you beg forgiveness. And if your great-grandmother is angry with you, you leave the country and wait for permission to re-enter, right? In South Wales this day, men hand over their money to their wives on Friday. The wives give the beer money back, and then the wives cooperate to manage the community. And that's still a current practice, right? So that's where I grew up. So you need to understand that, you know, I come from a matriarchal community. The girls' rugby clubs, because they've got very little money, we're talking in the valleys about families who've gone 3 generations without employment. Yeah, from having been the sort of, you know, the miners, you know, the elite of the industrial Britain. Yeah, they're now at the bottom end of it. Yeah, no industry, no jobs, no hope. Yeah. So what actually happened is the girls reckoned if they played rugby, they didn't have money for beauty parlors, but if they played rugby, they'd be fit. And then they actually, their whole narrative to Cardiff girls, you know, they hate Cardiff. You know, it's a big city, it's BBC, it's elite, is, you know, Cardiff girls pay for their beauty, we're fit. And that's one of their identity things that they're actually pushing. So we got them to act as ethnographers, we got community centre participants to act as ethnographers, and we also got schools to send their kids out to act as ethnographers. And this is a program we're now launching around COVID for people who are interested, right? Because kids get stories from adults that nobody else gets. And actually, if children investigate a problem, they can often come up with solutions for themselves. We did a project in Ohio on this, on obesity in children, which was funded by Victoria's Secrets, which is kind of like has an irony about it, right? And I basically designed the program. I got the children to act as investigative journalists to adults who are obese. And we actually got measurable changes in their own behavior because they worked out for themselves that they should eat more healthily because of what they might otherwise become. If we tried to teach them to eat healthily, they'd have rejected it in the manner of all teenagers. So we made them journalists in that case. But coming back to the valleys, school children are ideal for this because they can ask naive questions. No adult refuses a child on a school journey. And the way we do this is that you either tell a story or you capture a story. And the story can be a photograph or voice or text or any combination thereof. So for example, if I'm a nurse in a hospital, I can take a picture of the patient. I can record the patient's story. We're about to do this for day of death stories from patients in COVID because their relatives can't be with them at the moment because of isolation. So that's an extreme case. But you get a story from the patient, and the nurse can fill out some forms, i.e. the legal compliance stuff. The whole of that is called a sense-making item. It's a combination of media which people have used to make sense. And then the person interprets their own story. And we normally use 6 triangles. The triangles have all positive labels. And people place their story onto each of the 6 triangles, which gives us 18 metadata points. Now, I'll just explain this more briefly. If you've ever done an employee satisfaction survey or a hotel, were you happy with us type survey, you know the way it works. They ask hypothesis-based questions. So for example, in employee satisfaction, the one we got in IBM, which I always remember, is does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? And you know exactly what answer they want. So if you're in a good mood, you say 10, a bad mood, you say 0, and so on. We take a very different approach. We say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company? That's a non-hypothesis question. And then the 6 triangles have all positive labels. So one of the triangles says, in this story, the manager was altruistic, assertive, analytical. So I have to balance those 3. Now, balancing 3 positive qualities, the brain doesn't know what the right answer is, and that creates a cognitive load. If you ever see people answering a survey, they just go through it very quickly. You can't do that this way. And a different part of the brain comes into operation. It's called novelty receptive, which is more right hemisphere, rather than autonomic, which is more left hemisphere. Kahneman called this thinking fast and thinking slow. So you switch people from thinking fast to thinking slow. Yeah? That means they reflect more, and you can see them choose over the 6 triangles exactly where they'll place their story. And of course, I've got 18 data points. That means I've got a quantitative technique, and quant scales, because actually the numbers carry the stories with them. So that means I can send out 50 kids to gather stories over a day and end up with 500 stories. I can repeat that tomorrow and I can look at changes. I don't need any additional processing, because the processing is done at the point of entry. And for those of you up on the literature will know this is also called epistemic justice. Yeah, this is a phrase from feminism in the States. The way we describe something, or how you describe things, can influence what people are. So one of my research assistants, Beth, who has got a wonderful way of saying this, she says, the best illustration is old men are philosophers, but old wives tell tales. And if you say it like that, you privilege one group over the other. So what we're trying to do is to privilege individuals to actually interpret their story as well as give their story. So in traditional narrative research, you hand your story over and then the expert interprets it. Here, you have the power of interpretation. Right, so 2 illustrations on that, and I'll come to the 3rd point, and then we're probably getting close to questions. Yeah. So what we did in the valleys is we gathered that data. We then gave effectively a minister in the government looked at the pattern, and we do this in what are called fitness landscapes. So I'll show you a fitness landscape now, because it's easier to show it than do anything else. So let's see if this works. I'm not going to project it because I've discovered on Zoom everything goes wrong if I do that. Yeah. Okay, so this is a fitness landscape. So what I've got is 18 data points gathered over several thousand people. Yeah, that allows me to produce, and this is a probability distribution. It comes from evolutionary biology. It's a fitness landscape because it indicates effectively contour lines. It's the ability of things to move quickly between one domain and another. So in this case, you can see that there's actually several different patterns. They're color coded in different ways. Yeah. And that means I've got a very complex environment. I've got different communities seeing things in different ways. Now, if you, don't worry about the dimensions on this, but if, for example, the bottom left hand of this matrix is a bad place and the top right hand is a good place, what I need is to start to migrate people towards the top right and away from the bottom left. So the people in the light blue at the bottom, the best I can hope is to shift them to where the purple is, if you see that. Yeah. So what I do is I click on the purple and I read the stories, and this is key. I can go from an accurate statistical representation to the raw narrative. And then I can say, what can I do tomorrow to create more stories like these? Then I click on the bottom of the blue, fewer stories like those. And that is a whole new theory of change. It's called vector theory of change. More stories like this, fewer stories like that, anybody can engage it. If I say, how do we become more aware of the community needs? People will say we already are. Yeah, but if I say I want more stories like this and fewer stories like that, there's no such judgment in it, so people can engage in micro solutions. So I say we did this in the valleys, and we ran workshops with local facilitators. We didn't bring in external facilitators, and we allowed young kids to come and be trained to use the software, which they wanted to be, and we gave them certificates which helped their careers. We discovered the reward they wanted was a certificate, which said they'd been involved in a program, because that would improve their job prospects, their university degree. That was the most important thing to them. So that was the easier thing to give. But they could only come on that if they brought somebody from their grandparents' generation with them to come to work on the problem. And there were a lot of cognitive neuroscience reasons behind this linked to brain plasticity. So people under 20 are very innovative, sparks of genius, sparks of ideas. People over 50 tend to be innovative by synthesis and integration of ideas, which is why you see most original work in the humanities is done by people who are older, and innovation in the sciences done by people who are younger. Yeah? There are evolutionary reasons for this as well, because grandparents were the primary child carers for most of our evolutionary history. And the guys in the middle, the 20 to 45-year-olds, are actually out hunting for the tribe and generally aren't open to novel ideas. So we're all like this at some stage. Yeah? So when we do innovation programs in companies, we put new joiners with about to retired in pairs. So you've got bright ideas from the young kids and network knowledge and understanding from the older guys. So that's what we did in the valleys. And one of their best interventions came from a story called Connor's Bike. Because it turned out, and the actual intervention was to build a bike park on the back of a pub with mountain bike runs going up the side of the hill. Yeah, valleys, they're called the valleys for a reason. They're steep hills, yeah, and mainly glaciated. So basically, we went to the Welsh government and said, but you spent all this money to create a bike park. And I said, no, you've got to realise, the pub where they built the bike park used to be where all the drug dealers met. Yeah, we didn't know that, but the locals knew it. So by building a bike park in the pub car park, the drug dealers couldn't meet them anymore. Yeah, the pub owner liked it, so he funded part of it. The fire service built the runs because they wanted the kids to actually be fire spotters in summer because they couldn't afford the labor. Yeah, and everybody was happy. It cost you absolutely nothing, but it recreated a community focus in that valley, and they worked together and they achieved the result. And I said, we have 15 or 20 of these. And I still remember in the Welsh government, they basically said, but we can't announce that in the newspapers. We want a grand initiative. Yeah, something which we promise in 3 years' time will transform everything. And they've been announcing those as your government and everybody else's government have been for years. What we actually found is communities can generate very small examples, and that all came from the more stories like this, fewer stories like that. Another example on this is work we did with Roma in Hungary. So we got Roma, and people who live in that part of the world will know how problematic this area is. Yeah, we got Roma kids to act as ethnographers to the Roma community, which meant they got access to material that nobody had ever got before. We then took effectively a cluster of stories which had been interpreted by Roma and presented that to the anthropologists responsible for Roma policy for the European Union, and asked them to interpret it the way they thought Roma had interpreted it. And then we showed them the difference, and the difference was huge. Yeah, same data, the way they saw it was very different from Roma. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. One is, when people interpret their story, they actually don't interpret the story. What they do is they add layers of meaning to it. Yeah, they're basically placing the story in the context that you presented to them, and that's where the power comes. And the other thing is kind of like you haven't lived their lives. And we did the same thing with young girls who'd be genetically mutilated and raped in Africa. We made them ethnographers, which was better therapy for them than being counseled. But there's no way an expert on sexual health in Washington can index material the same way as somebody who's been raped. It's just not possible. You see the world in different ways. And the difference is called a gradient in complexity, and it should give you new meaning or new insight or new understanding. You want that sort of difference. The wrong responses are, oh my God, we should index it the way they do. The worst one, which is what we get about 50% of the time, is they don't understand their own stories. I'm the expert. Yeah, and that is 50% of projects start off like that. And with all bar one case, when you say, how can somebody not interpret their story properly, people start to realize what you're talking about. Yeah? So that's kind of like a fitness landscape. This, interesting, is another one. This was actually used for peace negotiation. So in this case, we didn't ask for stories. We presented a government statement about the future of the country to both former terrorists, the armed services and government. We got them all to interpret that in the same day-long period, so there was no consultation. Yeah? So same interpretive structure, same source data. And you can see on this, blue is the former terrorists, green is the army, red is government. There's no point whatsoever in getting the army to sit down with the former terrorists because there's no overlap. And actually here, scarily, they both hate the red guys. The strategy here is to make the extremes more extreme, to split them off, yeah, so that the whole system can come together in the middle. We're actually doing 2 of these at the moment, which you can all participate in for free this week. One is micro scenario planning about the future, post-pandemic futures. Yeah, and we can create your network, a unique URL for that. The other is we're going to use this technique to look at the ethics of triage decisions. Because triage decisions have been made every day for some people to die and some people to live around COVID. So those are 2 that you can participate in. So this concept of it's called distributed cognition. I'm getting people to describe their own condition, and I'm making small changes in the way they in what we call adjacent possibles. So I can more stories like this, fewer stories like that. And particularly if they generate their own interventions, the system is generally nudging itself in the right direction rather than playing games with explicit targets. Yeah? So I've talked about small things producing massive effects. I've talked about the need for distributed cognition. This also covers what's called disintermediation, the need for decision makers to do it directly at the raw data and not look at it through interpretive lenses. Yeah? So the final point I want to make, and this is probably in some ways the most critical. One of the key things is we're trying to switch people from an engineering metaphor to a biological metaphor. So for the last 30 years, the engineering metaphor has dominated. It came in with systems thinking in the 80s, which was largely derivative of cybernetics. Yeah, so that's where you get the field diagrams, the feedback loops, you know, the complex models, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, the assumption is that things can be modeled. In a complex system, we know they can't, because the next time, in fact, even doing the model changes the system if people become aware of it. So what you have to do is manage this evolutionary potential of the present, yeah, which involves a sort of mass engagement. But it also involves a different focus, and a focus away from individuals to a focus on identity. And the key thing I want to get across here is that what matters in a complex system is not the people and not the things, but the way they interact. Mm-hmm. We're defined by how we interact with people, not by what we are. It's quite interesting. I mean, things like Myers-Briggs, if anybody suffered that particular pseudoscientific approach, right? And that arose out of engineering. It's been absolutely proved to be pseudoscience. You don't get replicable results. Yeah, that's not scientific. The origins are very dubious as well. But it's a desire to try and pretend that people are like widgets in a manufacturing process. Oh, this is an ISBJ. We need 3 of those, please, and can we replace them? Yeah? The reality is people change radically by who they interact with. And that's called identity. And linked with that, for anybody into Deleuze, we've also got the concept of assemblages. So as people tell stories, other people tell similar stories, you listen to the stories you like, you tell similar stories. There's a point where those stories get a critical mass. This is called an attractor in complexity theory, a trope in narrative theory, an assemblage in Deleuzian epistemology. And basically what it is, it's a whirlpool that sucks you in and you can't escape it. For my many and various sins, I have to read Trump's tweets every morning, and have done for the last 3 years, which is a very depressing experience. But what he is, he's a genius at using key phrases to activate tropes. So people are already sucked into the narrative he's created, so he just keeps activating it. So there's a big narrative which he created, which is institutions like the UN and the World Health Organization take American money but do nothing for us. So he's gone straight into that trope when he needs somebody to blame for his own inadequacy. Now, we need to be aware of this because it's fundamental, and all of us who are on the other side of the politics are just as guilty, because we all like to hear stories which reinforce what we believe. And the problem is that in a network world, that's made it worse rather than better. A friend of mine called Tom in the Canadian Mounties famously expressed this. He said, it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because we knew who the idiots were. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy, to which I add an elected president of the United States. Right? The point is, if you hyper-connect people without any inhibiting factors, without buffers, the system always becomes pervert because like comes with like, and people become antagonistic, not cooperative. So if you can include buffering in the system, then you stop that process. So our big vision, and this is one of the COVID projects, is to have every child at the age of 16 in every community acting as an ethnographer to their community every month. Because if we can do that, we've got a human-mediated database of knowledge and learning, which allows peer-to-peer exchange and is not subject to the tyranny of the herds or the tyranny of who can write the algorithms to generate the most social media the fastest. So complexity has an intense amount of practical import. Our main application, we originally developed, so you know, the origins to understand the weak signals, which would mean a civilian population would support terrorists. Right, now, I'll give the context on this. Terrorism only survives when there's enough bad feeling in the community to feel a level of injustice. So if I give my own personal example, I was a Jesuit postulant. I was working on peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland in the 70s after university. And I was walking down the Falls Road one night, which is a Catholic area. And I got picked up by the police, this is a state, and asked which of my legs did I want shot first. And then they heard my accent and realized I was from the mainland. I wasn't from Ireland, so I wasn't a filthy take. So they bundled me out to the back of the Land Rover and left me there. Now, if the provisional IRA commander had come around that night, I might have joined. Yeah, because you've got that level of injustice, which means you react the other way. And that's actually critical for things like climate change. People give up or they get angry. Yeah, and there's a point where they suddenly twist and they either give up completely or they get angry to the point where they get violent. It's not a gradual change, it's a sudden change. So we focused on how to predict that and how to gather the material. So that was the origin. But since then, the bulk of the work has been in community development, the development community generally, and also in health and welfare. So in COVID at the moment, we're just launching, it will all be up on the website tomorrow finally, a family pack, which allows family to gather stories of what it's like to be confined. It allows their children to be journalists to the condition, and we're going to set programs for them. It allows teachers to interact with pupils through narrative. It allows bereavement stories to be told if you lose a relative. We've got a health pack for health professionals, which is journaling again through learning. There's a government pack to allow government officials to act as forensic observers to what's going on. There's a body of stuff on here. But it's all based on description in the present, rather than idealistic visions of the future. And I'm going to finish off with that point. If you understand where you are and you understand where you can go, you can achieve change. If you constantly sit in workshops and talk about where you would like to be, you'll have a very satisfying life, but nothing will actually change. And that leaves 10 minutes for questions, I think.
Yeah, we are 15 to 6 here. Thank you so much, Dave. I remembered when you talked about the the project with the bike space in an area with a lot of infractionality. I remembered of a study made by this guy Eric Klinenberg. He was looking at the social infrastructure and mainly libraries. I told you that within EduCab we are keen into working with libraries in various countries, and one piece of research was about how if you plant libraries in such places with high rate of criminality and infractionality, you basically make it vanish in a matter of a month or even weeks, because that's a place where then children will go there, and with the children you'll have a lot of parents that will go and back and forth. So it's a good way to clean the area in that matter. So I would very much want to ask you one question about how do you see the roles of institutions that are part of what we call it the social infrastructure of the world? And here, of course, we have the public libraries, we have community libraries, we have museums, cafe, bars, and some other institutions, cultural palaces as they are called in Eastern Europe, mainly. How do you see the importance and if you have examples working with such institutions, especially in small communities, in order to contribute to development, to civic engagement, and so on?
Don't forget the pub institution. Yeah.
Sorry?
Don't forget the pub institution.
Oh yeah, as we've talked, Dave and Gabi, I mean, for us, this is a matter of how can we make competition to the local pub.
Okay. The first thing that you need, I mean, let's go back to where you start. I mean, I know the library thing, and I know areas where it didn't work. The danger is we try and universalize context-specific solutions. Right? So the whole approach we're basically saying here is the community need to come up with ideas, but you create peer-to-peer flow. The way human beings make decisions is they do something called conceptual blending. So they take in a very limited stimulation, about 5% of what's available to them. That triggers memories of personal experiences, indirect experiences, stories they've read, and they blend that together to come up with a form of action. So what you want in peer-to-peer flow is access to lots and lots of stories about what other people have done, but you don't replicate it exactly. So I'll give a development example. Mohammed Yunus famously introduced microlending, in Bangladesh. It didn't work in Africa because microlending came from a very specific context with a primarily female audience, with home workers, with a high trust network in that sort of society. Didn't work in a patriarchal society. I talked about it with Torres Islanders in Australia, went back 5 years later, they'd adapted some of the ideas and some of their own ideas and created an equivalent. And now in India, because it's been publicized so much, the loan sharks have largely taken it over. So the danger is we keep trying to replicate the end point of somebody else's journey, and you can't do that. So the whole point about community engagement is to map the current narrative, link and connect over broad networks to get multiple fragmented ideas, blend those together and come up to something which is contextually appropriate to where you are, which shifts things in the right direction. Now, the stuff we do with the fitness landscapes is to make an empirically valid measurement system of what's called a vector. So instead of trying to achieve an outcome, we measure direction and speed of travel from the present for intensity of effort. That's called a vector measure. Okay? So you've still got a KPI, you've still got something that you can allocate funds again, but it's a measure appropriate to the actual system.
Okay, thank you. Now let's see questions, comments. Who wants to start? We have some that are already put here in the chat room, but if anyone wants to go live, you are more than welcome.
question about how can you not scale but move upwards, or I don't know if it's actually up. How do you transform practices that function at the grassroots level to the level of policy and decision making that can extract from those practices something that can work for wider public administration?
Okay, so there are two key concepts here. One is fractality and the other is entanglement, right? Both of which are worth an hour on their own, but I'll try and keep it relatively shorter than that. If you look at those fitness landscapes I showed you earlier, I can draw that landscape for a government minister for the whole of Wales. Or I can draw that landscape for the council in Rhondda Cynon Taf. Or I can draw that landscape for the residents of Ferndale. So I can take data from this ground level input and I can draw the landscape at people's level of authority or ability to take action. So the minister can say, what can I do tomorrow to take more stories like this and fewer stories like that? He can't say what other people should do. He has to say what he will do. Yet the chairman of the community centre has to say what they will do. So you're presenting the data so everybody can make small changes at their own level of competence to act. So that's fractality. The other issue is entanglement. By twisting together different timelines of different people, like young people who are deprived in the community with the timeline, say, of a minister, the timeline of a civil servant, so they can see what's similar and what different points of coherence, can actually make them understand things and make changes in a way that they will never do with a written paper. Yeah, so the whole concept of entanglement in a complex system is critical. So what you want is everybody engaged at a level of competence to act, everything potentially intangible, and everything safe to fail for small experiments in real time. Yeah, and it's also this concept of continuous change and continuous flow.
Okay, we have one question from Mara, but one small question. So, Dave, can you stay with us a little bit more after this 1 hour?
I've got to give a presentation at 4 o'clock my time, so no.
So no, okay.
I'm back-to-back webinars this afternoon. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Then we have a question from Mara. Mara, do you want to ask it yourself, or was it already answered? Do we have Mara? So Mara said, how do you select and make somebody an ethnographer or whatever when they've had no previous experience in acting?
I think Alexander answered that quite well, particularly children. Children have no problem with this. Mm-hmm. Children, I mean, so for example, the way we always started off is go and find somebody in your parents' and your grandparents' generation who you most admire and ask them to tell the story of their life that they think you should remember. That's called a sacred story. That's the norming point. Kids have absolutely no problem with that. They get really good material. They help the elder index it. Because you're not training them to do, I mean, ethnographic training takes years, and not many people make it anyway, because you're trying to deeply immerse yourself in the community and become invisible. I mean, my daughter's an anthropologist. She's paranoid about power because anthropology trains you to do that over many years, right? But the reality is, if people are acting as you know, distributed ethnography is basically people, innocent kids, asking questions of other people and recording the answers and getting the other people to interpret them. So it really is quite simple. And it gets away, as you know, as Leah said, you know, it's this concept that I'm the expert, I can tell you what your stories mean. Yeah, that takes too long. So there was a paper in Medium which is worth reading. I blogged on it a week or so ago, which basically said, look, big data is just gather everything you can and use algorithms on it, and that has value. Thick data is send in the ethnographers, and that gives you a lot of meaning but very low volume and takes a lot of time. We combine the two. Because people interpret their own data into a quantitative framework, we can get very large volume big data, but it always carries the explanatory narrative with it.
Okay, thank you. Tudor.
So first of all, thank you. It's mind-boggling, but very short. So I feel that we barely scratched the surface here. and I really want to learn more and know more. And because we have so very few, I think, minutes left, I will ask you, where could we start to find more about this?
Your best bet to be, I mean, the COVID thing has given us a big opportunity. So as of tomorrow morning, you can register for and download an app which will allow you to journal your learning during the COVID crisis. Yeah, that will be free for a couple of weeks because we're doing this as an experiment. This is joint with the UN. You'll also be invited to take part in a micro scenario planning of capturing stories of a post-pandemic future. And we can give you unique URLs for that if you want to look at your own network data independently of the mass data. Yeah. And then in a few days' time, we're going to do the ethical attitudes to triage. So respondents will be presented with 3 real situations, and I'm sorry, they are real, in which there wasn't an obvious right answer about who should be given the equipment and who shouldn't. And you'll be asked to interpret it and index it. And the results of that will be made public, and they're going into, you know, World Secretary General level in the UN thereafter to scale. So that will give you a chance to experiment. If you also look on the COVID site, you'll see the family pack, the health pack. They all have a chance to sign up and express interest.
Dave, can I complement your answer by my own, let's say, personal journey into complexity and conniving? What had been very, very educative for me along this, a bit more than a year, was reading the blog on your company website. Yeah, not only your blog, but your colleagues as well. Yeah, so on Cognitive Edge website, if you go, you have the blog section, which is free for all. Yeah, and a lot of those articles actually helped me better understand the science behind and how.
And it's also a lot of video materials in there. We've also shared on the event page some the link to the video material that is available on your website, and from there, as Gabi, you were saying, I mean, it's just a matter of digging, and there are like hundreds of hours probably of reading and watching videos. Okay. If there are any more questions, we have 3 more minutes with Dave, and then we'll continue for another 15-20 minutes.
A short comment.
Please, Mihai.
I really enjoyed your remark about Yunus and the failure of the micro-lending in Africa. It's a typical case when a lot of human resonating about an entrepreneurial approach it's involved, which obviously it's a pity that they didn't make it in Africa, but in the same time it's very relevant related to the fact that a certain entrepreneurial model, the success of a certain entrepreneurial model, social entrepreneurial model, is depending on the cultural context.
Yeah.
And it's very important, this conclusion, it's very important, especially for our cases as NGOs or initiatives which are dedicated to communities. I recall very recently, it was a question about why community foundation would be succeeding in a certain country and not succeeding in another country. And I think this cultural dimension, talking about common culture, talking about the distance between the power distance, talking about Hofstede and other measurements, I think they are very relevant for describing the potential of a social entrepreneurship endeavor, whatever would be, whichever would be the scope of the.
I'll just throw one comment in and then I have to go, right? I would be careful about Hofstede. He's a hugely intelligent man, that his models are cultural models based on a history of the European tradition. Yeah. What we actually find with narrative, with high abstraction signifiers, is you don't get the cultural overlay when you map culture. So that actually is important. Yeah. The other thing, and this is the key thing, there's a sort of Western liberal belief in homogeneity, which is very dangerous. You see it in Peter Senge, you see it in Otto Scharmüller. It's kind of like, if everybody was like us, the world would be a better place. And the answer is, well, it wouldn't be, and it can't happen anyway. Yeah. I famously called Senge neo-colonial, which he's not forgiven me for. What you actually need is what's called coherent heterogeneity. you need enough difference that the system is resilient and can evolve, but you don't want so much difference that it becomes conflicting. And that's called coherent heterogeneity. So recognizing cultural difference is key to actually making progress. And with that, I'm sorry guys, I'll have to go, but Gabriel knows where to get me and I can pick up on questions later.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure, Dave. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So yeah, we have, if you want, I mean, I'm very much inviting you to stay a little bit more. I would want to hear, for instance, from Gabriel, how you know, you are trying to connect the science of complexity applications on of the science of complexity and sense making that you are working with Dave, both in business but also trying to have an impact at you know, within communities and in community development, and you know, this bridge in between corporate and private, and then non-profit world.
Yeah, so I would relate again to some of the statements and explanations given by Dave. I don't think there's a bridge. Yeah, I think those words are entangled, as he used the word. Yeah, you can't cut a line and say this is work and this is my private life and that's the community and so on and so forth. Those things are intermingled, are entangled. Yeah. So with that being said, then it means yeah, you really have to act in that way, and it starts from small things. Yeah, from giving our colleagues at work the theory, the science behind it, play at work with it, but then also try to play around us with it. Yeah, and we have a few engagements, as you know. We do some stuff with you and then to come as well, where it's not just okay, let's find some money to give to Mihai, and Mihai will do whatever he thinks he should be doing. But it's about being an active part of what Mihai would be doing with or without money, being involved, and that's community engagement. If I have. And I think one important thing here, it's about scale. We all want to scale, but then there is no such thing as one size fits all. So I have a small group of people that will play on the Xbox on site, and you've been in our company, you've seen we have quite a few entertaining devices and things over there. Yeah, but it's a bunch of people that play on the Xbox. It's a bunch that play ping pong. It's a bunch that do how do you call it, table football, and there are various ways of entertaining yourself in between being creative and productive. I think the same is valid in communities. Yeah, some people are naturally drawn towards libraries and try to help somebody understand how you should use a browser, or how you should need something, or a lot of those things.
As we are doing in Rusnov.
Yeah, as we did in Rusnov together. Yeah, so if you give people multiple choices, they will go where their natural inclination is. Yeah, and where they feel they can add, contribute, be meaningful in the society. And okay, being a company, you're also limited in resources, so you can't be everywhere. So yes, sometimes we are constraining those ways of involvement in not as many categories that we would want. We will choose 5, 6, 7 so that you have impact. And that's how we work. Yeah, it's everything intermingled, everything entangled, and we evolve. We don't. We've been colleagues in Ipsos, right? I hate these big programs that announce, inspirational, aspirational goals that are there, and then we work the gaps and then we try to solve it. No, a community, it's a living organism. Yeah, it evolves. Yeah, and it's important to understand it from the present and understand where it can go. Yeah, that vectorial approach rather than the classic corporate approach, which is dead wrong, I think, from the very beginning. But okay, that means to evolve as well of those goals. You avoid it and you leave it develop, grow, as we do as human beings. Yeah, I mean, let's look at us. Yeah, we have like what, 40, 50 people, 30 people now left on the call. How many of you, when you were young, did a plan for your life? Yeah, and I'm not, minimizing the importance of planning. That is important, but in complex environments, in complex situations, in communities, you don't put a goal there on the table and work towards it. You evolve. Yeah, as a human, you evolve into being who you are. The environment you grow in have an impact on you. Yeah, and who you are is not just what you made of yourself, but also what the environment you are in made of yourself. Yeah, so that's, I would say, how we approach it. How I try to encourage our colleagues to be part of this journey. And the other thing that's important here is, like, there's nothing mandatory in it. Yeah, people engage, and sometimes you have two people and then they talk, and stories travel as well, because we are social beings, and the stories said around the fire in our early stages of humanity are still happening, but today they are happening at the water cooler, or they are happening while we are having a coffee. The story travels, the meaning goes along with them, and then that forms an attractor that other people then will feel like, maybe I should explore a bit, in this part or in that part. And once they start that exploration, then you really got their attention, and it's not like there is a boss coming and telling us you should do this, you should do that. They start to be properly engaged. There is this intrinsic motivation that activates, and then people naturally start to contribute more and more, and realize themselves as well that there's plenty of room to grow and help others. And it's not easy in IT. In IT, is, I think, particularly a bit more difficult. You have a highly educated community, and I know, no disrespect for other communities, but it's above the average in intelligence if you take it at globe scale. That high above the average intelligence is also matched a bit with an introvert profile, and semi-autistic at times. To perform in this space, you need to be a bit of that. So that adds a bit of, again, complexity and difficulty, because there's no natural inclination to be outgoing, to be outspoken, to put yourself in front of a community and try to do something with them. But again, people are flexible. People are they have plasticity, and that never disappears to various degrees, is present with us along our life. What we do to kids today, and I hope more and more parents will realize that and will do less. By the way we educate them, we destroy that plasticity. We destroy that natural ethnographer that we talked earlier with Dave. So we need to do less, and we need to do different, even with the young ones, to engage. And that's another aspect which I think is important in our approach. We don't look just at ourselves as colleagues at work and how we contribute in the community we are part of, but we also take our kids on that journey. And on one side, we want to help kids understand science, because I think that's an important aspect, not only at the business level, but in general. And then, yes, another important aspect is art. Art gives us humans capacity to abstract. Best way to develop that capability in humans is through art. And Dave gave several times this example. If you look at our early stages as humans, in the caves, you first discover pictures. So drawing came before language. Art was there in humans before language evolved. So that is another aspect where we act. We want to help our kids be proficient in that. Okay, it doesn't mean everyone becomes an artist, but the more you develop a bit of an artistic skill, whatever that is, the better positioned you are to be able to do abstract thinking, and elevate your thinking from the basic level or wherever you are to a higher level through abstraction. And I think that's even more relevant not only in today's world, but in the future world, no matter how that looks post-COVID. That's what will forever differentiate us from machines. I don't see an anywhere near future where machines will be able to do abstraction, while we would be always able to do that. So on the long run, it's even more important beyond this crisis that is something you develop, and then the work you do with that consciously or unconsciously helps at that. Yeah, bringing people in libraries, having them discuss what they read, argue about it, you know, critically discussing about several aspects also develops that muscle of abstraction. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have Alexandra that raised the hand, and but before that, I want to see if Christina, who joined us, and thanks Christina for joining, Christina Vladu. I mean, if you want to talk a little bit after Alexandra, and maybe also Mihai, because I see him unmuted, maybe he wanted to say something, but afterwards maybe you can introduce us a little bit into something that, you know, this strategy for radical change, something that we've talked about like many years ago, and resonates with a lot of things that Dave was talking about today. And I was amazed to hear about, you know, the program that you participated at that moment, Christina, with that Canadian guy, or if I'm correct. Anyway, if you want and if you can, but Alexandra, please. You've raised your hand, Alexandra.
Sorry, I have a comment and a question to make, but we don't have to follow up on it. I just feel the need to put it out there. I think there are several differences between local communities and brand or company communities. One of them being the degree of difference or diversity you have in a local community versus a company community, the level of income, the level of, you know, the diversity of backgrounds, of class behavior, of, you know, identities. A difference in proximity. When you are connected by space or by a neighborhood, you have many things that are not in common, even conflicting. When you work in a company, there's much less diversity. There is diversity, but much less in terms of different worldviews. So the context is different as well. You're in a constant negotiation when you're in a local community, a constant negotiation for power that sometimes mean actual resources, living resources, health resources. So I think there's a big differences between, I feel the need to properly qualify communities. This is something that lately I've been thinking a lot of. And the question that I have, rhetorical or out there, is whether strong company communities, as I know Ipsos had as well, can translate to sort of behaviors in neighborhood affiliations as well. So do employees that are experienced communities, do they become better citizens? Do they become better neighbors? Do they translate these in other identities in their lives? I think they do. It seems like they do. So this is why it was rhetorical, more of a question, a comment than a question. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. It was a really cool conversation.
Thanks, Alexandra. Mihai, did you want to add anything, or you are just unmuted?
Actually, I would like to ask, while again, the whole discourse here, it's towards community, well, using certain ethnographic methods. I would like to rephrase it in the interest of the group of the students I'm here with. There are still a couple of them here while the classes are over. There is almost half hour, but anyway. So the pragmatic question would be, they are experts in sport. There are professionals dealing with sport, and the class, it's about involving sport professionals in solving community problems. How can they benefit from your presentation? I mean, from the methods you've been mentioning. If you have I don't know, a recommendation, something more specific they should live with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I think Dave actually gave one example, if I recall correctly, with some rugby initiatives in there. But I mean, I've stayed, as you might know, some of you, I've stayed for 7 months in the States last year. And as we all know, maybe from the movies, if not from, you know, direct experience, the idea of sport in there is one of the main catalysts, community catalysts in the country, because communities are gluing around sports events. We also had, along with Christina, actually, Vlad, when we were within the Ministry of Health, we went and in Norway with the delegation of health professionals from Romania to Norway, and we had the discussions with the various professionals in there, including the PR of the Olympic committee or something in there, and they were talking about the fact that they have 4 million registered volunteers in a country that is less than 4 million people, because a lot of people are getting involved in several volunteering activities, and a lot of the discussions were about how you have mothers going and cooking certain things or having clatite, pancakes for sports events for their kids, but also men and so on. So it depending, how do we see sports mainly as a competitive experience and action, or we see it as a community? So what paradigms are we using? So for me, this would be one of the paths, not necessarily answers.
I will add something to what you just said, Mihai, and it's my own opinion on it. Yeah, I think sport and sports in general have this capability to be attractors. Yeah, they energize and yeah, bring along communities of multiple backgrounds and so on and so forth. And I think there is also one thing that I hope will happen in sports as well. I'm not a football fan at all, but I still remember my early years, when that was played at amateur level, and everyone had a profession, and they were just doing football as well because they loved it. The sport was so much more enjoyable than it is today with those professional football players, where there's a huge amount of money being involved. I'm not saying the physical performance is not way above where it was, but that game lost its fun. It's not that much fun anymore to watch football. And even though it's not that much fun, it still attracts a lot of people. Other sports as well. It's valid in other sports, and I think that's another dimension where, sport can help. At any layer, and once we are there, viewers, maybe some become as well practitioners of a certain sport, and because that playing attracts people together. I'm looking at my grandma now village example where I pretty much grew up. Kids will gather on the football field and they will be telling stories. Adults will get on the football field at the end of the work week and they will be playing, having beers, and there will be there people of various ages and education and jobs, and that builds communities. So I think it also has this capability, as long as you are not just a spectator, but you are engaged with it at whatever level, and that goes for multiple sports. I use the football because it's very well known and admired, probably even in our society. But other sports, I think, have the same capacity, maybe sometimes even more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Guys, may I ask you why it's still English? Why aren't we switching to Romanian?
Because
we will be recording this, and I think it's good that others would be watching it and make sense of it, even though they are not trained.
Got it.
In order to have a continuation of the things, if anyone wants to add to what Mihai asked, please do. If not, I would kindly ask Christina to join in.
Okay, let me first thank you for inviting me to Dave's presentation. It was extremely nice for me. I may say that 20 years ago we were sort of trying this experience of the ethnologist children in Romanian villages. That was an extraordinary project to the Romanian Social Development Fund, but in the meantime, we needed to get poor community active. So we sort of invented what we call the community facilitation. And part of that facilitation, well, the public policy was something, and it was decided between the government, the Ministry of Finance, and the World Bank team. But the non-governmental part, where a number of people realized that more is needed for these communities to really come back to life. We created an NGO and we fundraised funds. And one of the projects that we had was to train teachers and children in the presence of their teachers, trained by actors on disinhibition. And then the actors were in the villages with these young children, following what was happening in the community. So practically the children were given this role of ethnographers, and they were spotting stories, and they were putting on in a small theater play the stories of the, I don't know, the thief, the person that were stealing wood, and the police guys not looking. Other stories of mothers being beaten by alcoholic fathers. Anyway, and everything was on stage in front of their teachers, in front of mass media from the county and from Bucharest and so on. And this was very powerful. It was extremely powerful. These young people were really blossoming after these kind of exercises, and the community was, we were calling this like taking steps towards some radical change. And it was a very interesting exercise. I liked the question that was put before: how can we take this upper to a policy level exercise? It wasn't, because lessons are not learned so easily at policy level. So. But there are many stories like that. I am very happy to discover Dave, and I will look more into his papers and his presentation. So thank you very much, Mihai, for making the link.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, can you tell us just like in a few minutes the ideas behind the strategies for radical change? Because I think those things are still relevant because it was also a disruption, what Dave is actually saying, and everything around system thinking. Because at the end of the day, this is also what Dave is talking about. System thinking, whereby it's a matter of how do you deal with the complexity and so on. And in the discussions we had, and you were telling me about those strategies and means of coming up with the change in a disruptive way, radical way.
Yes, the main idea, the basic idea would be that a radical change is a cultural change. So if, for example, to put it in a very simple, if we lived in totalitarian times, in a vertical, top-down kind of culture, the radical change would be to go to reciprocity, to respect, to all values that are horizontal. So and that's why even like in the early 90s, after my studies in leadership and strategies in radical change and so on, I was trying to follow up on all these kind of exercises that were empowering the postmodern type of leadership that is a more collective leadership, like this diversity, that's David is highlighting, and with these horizontal types of values between people, like I was mentioning, reciprocity, respect, friendship, collaboration, and so on, and not top-down
approaches,
like force and this kind of behavior. That is prevailing also today in so much in organizations. So one other thing Alexandra was asking about, how can we people in organizations, are we good citizens and so on. What I'm very much afraid is that people do conform a lot. Very few people are meta-analytical, and very many people are like to conform to norms and rules. And very often in organizations, you find the group thinking syndrome. So in order to feel secure and safe, you feel that you need to follow the herd. So so that's why it's very difficult to get out of that norm and to really be a person that like has the own head on the shoulders, let's say, and take action accordingly. So much again.
Thank you so much, Christina. And we are 3 minutes before ending what we've initially, said we will have from this event. Gabi, if you want to have some closing remarks, unless there are some other questions, comments. But also one thing that I want to ask you, if we can maybe have another event in the near future with Dave, because as I see from private messages that I get, but also from the ones that were sent to everyone, people really enjoyed the event and the talk, and they have more questions. So maybe it's good to have maybe the second event only with questions, now that people already heard Dave speaking, and to have this time for discussion. I feel that we need more, and people also participating said the same.
I was on mute, sorry. I was saying I can't commit on his behalf, but knowing Dave and working with him for a while, I'm quite sure he will say yes to this. It's just a matter of figuring out a time window in his pretty busy schedule. What I think would be worth doing in due time, as he gave that option to the group here, would be one from some of the captures that he's currently doing at scale, to do it in our community. And if we consider Romania a community, I see we have people here joining from many areas of the country, and I would say yes, we should. Okay, a country of our size, probably it's too big of a community, but trying to do that capture as well within our space would help. And discussing then the data that is captured in this pilot with Dave, it's what I would suggest as a second topic in the follow-up, on top of the other questions that were put here today and left unanswered because he had to join another webinar. And let's take it one by one. As a closing remark, well, thank you all for joining, and I'm happy you liked it. I think Dave, it's quite a revolutionary intellectual in this space of complexity and how you intervene in complex adaptive systems. If you'll have time to read his blogs, it's just a reinforcement. I learned a lot from his blogs. Let's stay engaged in that way. Maybe capturing some of the data he's currently capturing as a community and discuss it with Dave. And I'm sure we will find ways to recombine a lot of the things that we are doing. And then from there, you have exaptation, which I think is what Christina called, in her words, radical evolution, radical change. That's where things jump from one level to the other, and it's not slow. and in Dave's vocabulary and complexity thinking vocabulary, that is called excitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to highlight that this series of dialogues that we started in March, it's giving and nurturing a context for talking about development with such people as Dave, and I very much invite people that didn't participate to the other 3 ones to take a look, because things are interconnected, and that's why we are choosing these people to join us for such discussions. And we had the first event with John McKnight from the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, and then we had the second meeting with Edgar Khan, who was who operationalized the concept of time bank, which is something from the 18th, 19th century was used, but then he was the one who actually put it in a framework there. And of course, it was also Christine Gray with him in that talk. Then we had the second discussion with John McKnight, and now with Dave Snowden. So we are trying to bring this kind of people and talking from different angles about development with people that got into big fights and they have their stories, but this doesn't mean that the stories of each of us are not very relevant, and sometimes they are more relevant or equally relevant, and the fights at local level. And this final thing that I want to say is that one of the reasons we've started this, and this was a discussion I had with Alexandra Steff for like 1 year ago, was to nurture such space and have such people with us, in order to give courage to those that are on, doing grassroots working there, and sometimes they feel that they are overwhelmed by what's happening there, and they don't have the space to get oxygen, to have air coming to them, because they are these big speakers, big guys, big ladies that are out there, and they are doing this work in here. And actually we are doing the same thing. We're trying to contribute to better communities, better to be good around us. So I think it's growing nicely. Gabi, thanks a lot for coming up with the idea of having Dave participating to these dialogues, and I'm very happy how it's growing, and thanks to everyone who joined.
Yeah, thank you guys. See you next time.
Thank
you.
Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.